everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor James Edwards, and we're going to be talking about his book, The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition. This is a different solution to the synoptic problem that a lot of people may not have heard of before. And, there's a lot of different proposed solutions to the synoptic problem. The common solution being the two-document hypothesis that Mark and priority, Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, but Matthew and Luke were ignorant of each other, and they both borrowed from the hypothetical Q document. Or you have the Ferrer hypothesis, which eliminates Q, but says Luke used Matthew and Mark, and Matthew used Mark. Or MATTHEAN posteriority, Luke used Mark, and Matthew borrowed from Luke and Mark, and there's all kinds of these different solutions to the synoptic problem. So we're going to be getting into that today. Welcome, Professor Edwards of History Valley.
Thank you very much.
Let's start off with this. These are links that you can go to buy his book. Amazon, Eerdmans.com, christianbook.com. All the relevant links to purchase his book will be in the description below.
Yep.
With that being said, let's go to the next slide and get this going. The two-document hypothesis. So, Professor Edwards, what do you make of the two-document hypothesis? Do you find it, I know you don't necessarily believe in the Q document because you use the Hebrew gospel to solve the synoptic problem. But what do you make of this solution, nevertheless?
Right. Basically, I think the two-document hypothesis is very positive for two reasons. Number one, its simplicity. I think that Occam's razor here is always kind of an important guideline for us. Whenever you're dealing with a problem, the synoptic problem is a long-standing problem in Christian scholarship. It's been an issue since the beginning of the Christian faith and remains one. It hasn't ever really been satisfactorily solved. And the temptation is always to increase plausible factors. And I think the two-document hypothesis comes close to Occam's razor. That is, the simplest answer that deals with all of the questions is preferable. And certainly Mark has the two-document hypothesis posits that Mark is the earliest gospel, that Mark was used by Matthew and Luke. I think that 200 years of scholarship continues to make that increasingly plausible. In fact, it's accepted by the vast majority of people, of scholars. So that is its great contribution, to be able to say that two of the Gospels, Luke and Matthew, have relied upon the third, Mark, as their primary source, or at least one of their sources. The Q document, as you know, I am skeptical about. In fact, I don't believe exists. And we can talk about that. But that is the second part of the two-document hypothesis. And even though I hold that in suspicion, I'm grateful for the profound increase in the priority of Mark in the synoptic gospel solution.
What do you make of BURNETT, HILLMAN, STREETER'S four-document hypothesis? He's got the LM source, Proto-Luke, document of infancy, the Antiochian document. These extra hypothetical sources that he adds in the mix.
Right. I think that this is helpful. First of all, he continues to recognize that Mark is the source for Matthew. He doesn't recognize it as a source for Luke as well, or excuse me, he recognizes it for a source of Matthew and Luke. He then recognizes that Matthew has sources that we cannot identify. So he simply calls them M, and he does the same with Luke. And I think this is once again a step forward. because it builds upon the two source hypothesis and says that even if you accept Q, you still have other sources in order to explain, in order fully to account for the synoptic gospels as we have them. Matthew being unprovenanced sources, but nevertheless sources. The same with L. So Streeter's four-document hypothesis is once again a step forward, although I, as you know, do not think Q needs to be part of that hypothesis. But I certainly think that Mark, and then unique sources to Matthew and unique sources to Luke do need to be part of the synoptic hypothesis.
In the Farrer hypothesis, Luke used Matthew and Mark, and Matthew used Mark.
The Farrer hypothesis is great because it does not rely upon hypothetical sources like Q. I think that Farrer has the wrong order, but I think it's to be commended because he jettisons a hypothetical source for which we have no historical testimony or evidence. Mark, Matthew, Luke, he's dealing with the three gospels that we have. He traces Matthew from Mark, that's correct. He traces Luke from Mark, that's also correct. I think that if he had reversed it, it goes Mark, Luke, and then Matthew. That would have been more correct than his order for Matthew and Luke.
Matthian posteriority, Luke used Mark, but Matthew used Luke and Mark. So
This
vice
is,
versa.
I believe this is correct.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's all kinds of evidence when you look at Matthew that this is the end of the synoptic tradition, this symmetry of Matthew, 2 chapters of introduction, 2 chapters of passion conclusion, 5 divisions in between each one that begins with the teaching, then the summary when Jesus had finished all these things, including the narrative. The Gospel of Matthew is the most supremely structured, perhaps, book in the New Testament. It's also the clearest in Greek to read. It looks in so many ways to be the end of the synoptic tradition, the polishing, completed testimony. I just think that this Matthean posteriority is growing in acceptance by scholars, and rightly so, that Matthew really is the end of the synoptic tradition, who has built upon both Luke, but primarily Mark.
Could you give some examples for the audience of Matthew modifying Luke and Mark?
Well, there's many of them. I give a whole number in my book in which I argue that that Matthew's order and Matthew's wording makes greater sense. This is not in synoptic studies. One of the complexities of them is, and one of the dangers is, that there are no obvious single answers. This problem can only be approached and discussed, and if it can be solved, it can only be solved by a large number of factors. And the question you're asking is one of them. When you compare 2 historical documents, asking which one is prior to the other, which one has used the other, you can't make that usually on the basis of 1 or 2 pieces of evidence. But on composite evidence of the final document. And this is the case for Matthew as well. Matthew's, for example, taking all of the material that Luke disseminates among several chapters, combining it into chapters 5, 6, and 7 for Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is certainly a good example. The fact that Matthew has given usually a shorter and cleaner version of material in Mark shows editing. Mark talks about Jesus healing a man with an unclean spirit. Matthew identifies that as epilepsy. We see all of these movements on the part of, or these editorial conventions on the part of Matthew to what we would call, these are editorial improvements, specificities, cleaner, shorter, and also Matthew includes so much more than Mark does. So it looks as though both he and Luke are building upon Mark, but Matthew especially is seeking to build upon both of them and produce for the church a gospel that would really be acceptable to all the church.
What do you make of Theodor Zahn's interpretation of the Hebrew gospel hypothesis that Greek Matthew used Luke and Mark, Mark used Hebrew Matthew, and Greek Matthew used Hebrew Matthew?
The attempt to link canonical Matthew with the hypothetical Hebrew Matthew that I talk about in my gospel that is so widely attested in the early church has been attempted for years, largely on the basis of the common name. Both are named Matthew, and the assumption is that the Hebrew Matthew that the fathers, to which the fathers attest, is therefore the Hebrew version of the Greek Matthew, which is our first gospel in the Synoptic Tradition, or in the New Testament. And this is just, in my mind, a failed assumption. It's a natural one to make, but it's a false step. Because when you look at the canonical Greek Gospel of Matthew, it simply can't be translated successfully back into Hebrew. It's very non-Hebraic. It's very clean Greek. It's the cleanest, really most pleasing and satisfying Greek in the four Gospels. Luke, on the other hand, at least special Luke, that material in Luke, it was unique to Luke, it's 50% of Luke, that is not present in either Mark or Matthew. This material, by and large, can be translated quite successfully back into Hebrew. And in that special Luke, we see lots of Hebraisms. So I think that this attempt to link Hebrew Matthew with the Greek Matthew that we have in our New Testament is it's laudable, but it's wrong.
Look at this Fragments of Papias, section 6, just real quick. Many scholars interpret Papias as, at least with his wording, he says Mark wrote a gospel, and then he follows it by saying, then Matthew wrote a gospel, as if it's an awareness that Mark came first in the canonical gospels of the canonical gospels. But he also mentions, I know you talk about this in the book too, that there's a Hebrew gospel of Matthew right in the bottom of that. It's underlined for the audience so they can see it. Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language. That's what Papias says. And it almost looks like Papias is distinguishing it from another Matthew of the Greek one. So could you talk about this real quick?
Well, I think that's correct. I think that's exactly what he does. Papias is early, and it looks as though his testimony here is correct. It's not the only early testimony to the priority of Mark. Actually, when you look at Revelation chapter 4 and 5 and see these perspectives on the gospel, the lion, the man, the ox, the eagle, those were representatives of the early gospel. It's interesting that the lion, Mark, is mentioned first in Revelation. And this strikes me. In fact, the order in Revelation goes Mark, Luke, Matthew, John. I think that's exactly their chronology. And it may be, in my mind, it likely is attested to in the book of Revelation as well. Papias does the same thing, that Greek Matthew is not the Matthew that he's talking about. It's rather written in Hebrew, and he distinguishes it from it. We should remember that Matthew was a very common name in the Old Testament. It was kind of like James in my generation, or Derek is today. It was not unusual for more than one person to be known as Matthew. We have 3 Matthews already in the Gospels and in the early church, and so it's not too surprising, and it's certainly not implausible that we just have a coincidental agreement between Greek Matthew and Hebrew Matthew, 2 different Matthews.
The logia that Papias mentions, he mentions that a particular individual called Aristian writing between Mark and Matthew. At least that's the way he seems to put it.
Right.
And he has him writing a logia. Could that by any plausible means be a reference to Luke of some kind before that's sandwiched between Mark and Matthew?
Well, that's a very interesting idea. It's one that I haven't heard very often. The answer, of course, is yes, it plausibly could. Where the early church, or I should say the ancient world, did not want to give evidence of authorship. It doesn't name authors. Only in letters are names given, in Paul's letters, but none of the Gospels has a name attached with it in its earliest copies. And this was true throughout the ancient world. It was seen to be bad form for an author to attach his or her name to a document, much like it is today, I think, for a person to announce how much money he or she makes. That we just don't do that. And somehow authorship was regarded as like that in the Old Testament. And so already by the time of Irenaeus, this is 100 years after the writing of these documents, there is some doubt about who these people were. That's not surprising. Irenaeus tries to follow this out, and so he comes up with this chronology of the authorship of these documents, and Papias does the same, and we're grateful for that. They very well, that could possibly be Lucan material, but the question then would remain, no other author draws this connection, makes this hint, and so that then would seem to suggest that if your suggestion is correct, that it was very quickly fell into anonymity and was forgotten.
Could Irenaeus and late 2nd century Christians that came to the conclusion that Greek Matthew is the first gospel, could that have resulted in confusing Hebrew Matthew with Greek Matthew that
Yes.
caused Matthew?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know what more to say, but absolutely. Whenever something comes first, it seems to have priority, and that then would be a way for those people who really don't compare these languages to answer the question. We have to remember that Hebrew really falls out of not just favor, but knowledge after the first generation of Christians. The early church moves into the Gentile world so rapidly and so successfully that it completely abandons Hebrew in order to both convey the gospel to non-Jews and to spread the gospel in its mission outreach in the world. We don't have a single New Testament text. And now we have almost 7,000 fragments of New Testament text, some of them whole, like Sinaiticus or Codex Alexandrinus. But of course, 99% of them fragmentary. We don't have a single fragment of a Hebrew New Testament text. And this shows us how entirely, how universally the early church separated itself from the Hebrew language, not from the Jewish people, not from the Jewish tradition, certainly the Old Testament tradition, but from its language. And with that loss came knowledge of Hebrew among the patristic fathers. So far as we know, only Ephraim knows Hebrew because he's Syrian, but only Origen and Jerome know Hebrew. And Jerome has to learn it from Jewish rabbis in Bethlehem. So Hebrew falls out entirely of the vernacular of the early church, and with it, the Hebrew gospel is largely lost and beclouded.
Let's go back to the Q document real quick. The Q plus Papias hypothesis by Professor Dennis MacDonald, a significantly modified version of the Q document hypothesis. So he's also modifying the modified Q document hypothesis, which suggests that Mark also made use of the Q document. But he also says that Luke used Papias, and he claims that Papias is ignorant of Luke and John, and so he thinks Papias wrote in between Matthew and Luke. What do you make of this?
Oh, I think this is complex and probably implausible. First of all, we have to remember that when we're talking about the logoi or Q, so-called Q, that we are using a modern construct for which there is no ancient testimony. We don't see within the New Testament tradition any reference to a collection of Jesus's sayings. We don't find in the early church any such collection. When we read Jerome's letter to a book to illustrious men, 175, they're all men, so we have to use that word, leaders of the early church, it's basically a bibliography of early Christianity up to Jerome's day. Jerome dies in 431. So it's a very significant document. There's about 800 texts that he mentions by name. Not a single one of those texts accords or even approximates the format and the supposed content of the Q source. So Q is something that was first proposed by Schleiermacher, and there simply is no ancient source that mentions this. And for me, that is a real problem. And for me, this is a strength of my argument. I'm dealing with texts that for which we have historical attestation. So let's go to Mark. Yeah, Mark is fine. Matthew is fine. Papias. We have so little of Papias preserved that it's precarious from my viewpoint to draw broad, more economic conclusions with regard to Papias, putting him into the tradition of the Gospels, because I just think we have way too little information to do that. Putting Luke after Papias into the 2nd century, seems to me needlessly and without needlessly late, and really without any significant evidence. So I'm skeptical about this particular rendition.
So you think that Papias knew all four Gospels?
Oh, I have to be careful here because I don't think of Papias in terms of all four Gospels. I think of him in terms of Matthew and Mark. He, of course, does mention John. He loves to trace his lineage to John, so we can probably assume that. But once again, our literary evidence from Papias is simply too limited, and it's too precisely dedicated to this early Matthew texts to draw broader conclusions, I think, about the Synoptic Tradition from Papias.
You have a super chat question. We'll turn to the slides in a second. Donnie Springer, thank you to the $5. Who would you say the intended audience of Greek Matthew is? Does Matthew posteriority for the historical context seems to have less Pauline influence? It's a question for you.
Right. Well, the intended audience for Greek Matthew. It's a great question. It is the early church, it's the Greek-speaking early church of the latter part of the first century. That is inevitably and painfully separating from the Jewish synagogue. Whether the church is experiencing brutality and hostility by being expelled by the synagogue, or whether this is just a separation, of mitosis from the Jewish synagogue, or both, which is more likely the case. I don't know, but it's very clear that Matthew, Greek Matthew, wants to show the errors of the Jewish synagogue and the corrections of them in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he sees himself as an attempt to make an interchange with the synagogue to its proper development into and conclusion in the early Christian church. Does Matthew have Pauline influence? Yeah, a colleague of mine, Roger Morlang, wrote his doctoral dissertation on that, sees some of that. And I think I haven't really researched that personally, but I would be, that seems plausible to me, given the fact that, once again, Matthew looks like one of the older, or the oldest testimony in the Synoptic Tradition, and he therefore would have been both aware of Paul and perhaps been willing to utilize Pauline influence in his final product.
Let's take a look at the Anti-Marcionite prologue real quick. So on the bottom there, it says that Papias was a scribe for John, and John dictated the gospel to him. Would you say that this is evidence of a second century awareness that Papias was aware of all four gospels?
It would look like that. I'm not as familiar with this Anti-Marcionite prologue as to say a whole lot more than that.
Okay.
But yes, I think that could be warranted. But what that means, I don't really know, because we know that Papias, we know that in the 2nd century, we see this in Irenaeus. There's a great interest in showing one's relationship to the apostolic tradition, especially as that was represented by John, and that Papias is part of that. Irenaeus himself is part of that. And that is very important for their legitimation of both their teaching and their authority in the church. As the monarchical episcopacy becomes more important in that 2nd century, that reference to and that relationship to the apostolic tradition, especially in John, who lives a long time and leaves quite a group of disciples, is really important for them.
So now we come to a list of attestation by 20 church fathers. You also mentioned this in your book. So for the audience, all these church fathers here all mention the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. That takes me back to the Q document real quick, because some scholars will try to say, and I know you address this in the book as well, that Papias does mention the Q document and he calls it the Logia. Now, how would you respond to that?
Well, he doesn't mention the Q document. He mentions the Logia, which are the sayings, the oracles. We also have the traditions of the early church. I don't think that we have that, of course, in all of the Gospels, and especially in Matthew and Luke, the material that differs from Mark. This could be the Logia. This is a general term, and its precise reference is unknown and certainly debated. But to draw an explicit connection between that term and the highly defined Q document seems to me quite a large, it's a gigantic leap that I would not be willing to make.
Okay, so we arrive at the Hebrew Gospel hypothesis, this diagram that you also have in the book as well. Could you explain what's happening here, like the Gospel of Luke taking from the double tradition and the Hebrew Gospel taking from, so the Gospel of Luke taking from the Hebrew Gospel double tradition and Gospel of Mark? And I'm also going to correct some.
Right. Okay. This hypothesis and this diagram is very basic, even though it has 6 different boxes. So you go to the Gospel of Mark, and we see that Mark is the progenitor, is the source for both Matthew and Luke. That is widely recognized and affirmed. We talked about that at the beginning of the program. So I stand with the majority of scholars in this point. Go to the second 2 boxes here, the additional sources of Matthew. Virtually everyone agrees that there is material in Matthew for which there is no reference in Mark or any other known source. And so that too is part of the standard assumption with the Synoptic tradition, that the Gospel of Matthew used material additional to Mark and the Q document, if you want to use that, or the double tradition as I use it, that we simply do not know its origin or its name. And so we simply have to put a box of ignorance here of unknown sources. The same thing is true with Hebrew Gospel, except in my book, I argue that this 50% of the Gospel of Luke that has no correspondence in either Matthew or Mark has such strong affinities with the Hebrew language. And on the basis of that, I argue that this, in fact, is the gospel that the early church knew under various names. The gospel of the Eerdmans, the gospel of the Hebrews, the gospel of the Nazarenes. It went by various names. That's not surprising. We know that it was one of the 5 documents, according to Eusebius, that was balanced on the brink of acceptance as to be canonical or rejection as non-canonical. It fell into the rejection category, probably should have fallen into there. But Eusebius recognizes this gospel and its fluency and its well-known acceptance in the early church. There is no other non-canonical document in early Christianity that is as widely and as approvingly received as this Hebrew gospel. I argue that this is the second source to the Gospel of Luke. However, there also is a group of verses, I count them to 177, that are quite similar to Matthew, that are not part of this Hebrew tradition. I simply call it the double tradition. The Q scholars would want to call this Q, but I don't call it Q because Q is seen to be strictly a saying source that has no passion narrative to it and no miracles. So Q gives us the wise Jesus, who is a kind of a Christian Socrates. But the double tradition actually extends into the passion narrative and has a miracle story in it. And so I simply call it the double tradition because it does not have Hebrew associations. It's not part of Mark, and yet it looks to be part of both Luke and Matthew. Hence, my construction here says that both Matthew and Luke can be attributed to 3 sources. In Matthew's case, it's Mark, the double tradition, and special Matthew, or the additions to Matthew. In Luke's case, it's Mark, the double tradition, and the uniquely important Hebrew gospel.
Another super chat here. Johnny Springer, thank you for the $5. Where would you place Acts in the sequence? For example, Luke seems to be rewriting Papias' account of the death of Judas, while Matthew seems to be unaware of it.
Oh, I put Acts as a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. I don't think, that's the prologue to both of them is similar. The language is similar. We see the infinitive construct of Hebrew that Luke uses. No other New Testament author uses it, except it appears also in several places in Acts. So I take Acts as a sequel to Luke. And the question is, Luke seems to be writing Papias' account of the death of Jesus, and Matthew seems to be unaware of it. I'm not able to say anything specific here because I would need to really look at that side by side, and I can't do that off the top of my head.
No problem. Thank you for the super chats, Donnie. If anyone else has any questions for Professor Edwards, please super chat them or send them through PayPal. I'll read them there. So how would you distinguish between something like Special Luke? Because I know you said earlier that Special Luke is like 50% of Luke, and it has Hebraisms that's there, unlike Greek Matthew, which has 0 Hebraisms.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any attestation for that, or do you think even without attestation that has stronger evidence, internal evidence than there ever has been for Q?
Oh, yeah. Once again, the Q hypothesis has a 200-year history behind it. It begins in Schleiermacher in 1820s. The Hebrew Gospel is, as I've said, widely testified or attested to in the first 1,000 years. Nicephorus in 900 is the last person to reference it. That's a long testimony, and it has two dozen names of patristic scholars who actually attest to it from all around the early Christian church, from Ephraim the Syrian, well, who is both a Christian but also is one of the few fathers who reads Hebrew, the Syriac tradition. So we have the historical attestation to the Hebrew gospel that we do not have for Q. But also in Luke, we see in special Luke this demonstrated proclivity with Hebrew rhetoric and Hebrew style that Luke, who is able to write very good Greek, chooses not to overwrite, but actually to display in his gospel. And I think he does this in order to, out of preference for and respect for this early Hebrew source. There's a distinctive linguistic difference in Luke when you get to special Luke, as opposed to Luke's the other 50% of Luke that is not related to the Hebrew gospel. So my theory is simpler, and it's dealing with known historical sources, whereas the Q theory is dealing with non-attested sources. I think they're invented sources, and it's much more complex.
My question was, is there any attestation for special Luke? The 50% of Luke's gospel that's in Hebrew, or do you think that material is in the Hebrew gospel of Matthew?
Let's see. The attestation for the Hebrew gospel is widely given in the early church fathers. We've mentioned that. The special Luke demonstrates linguistic similarities with Hebrew. It's the kind of Greek that you would write when you're translating from Hebrew without trying to cover that up. For example, the infinitive absolute. When Jesus in Luke says, desiring, I have desired to eat this meal with you. That's a Hebrew infinitive absolute. Luke's not translating that out. He is being very conspicuous with that. Why? Because he values this source and wants to be faithful to it. So I see this as a thesis that has strong abilities to demonstrate itself both historically and linguistically.
Final question. When would you date all of these gospels that we've mentioned so far?
Well, once again, back to our original point, scholars, or I should say authors in the ancient world, not only did not put their names on their documents, they did not date them. And so we are dealing with the same problem here of the two things that for us are primarily important for any form of literary certainty. Can't even get a book today published if it does not have an author and a date on it. In the ancient world, you couldn't get it published if it had those. So dating is extremely slippery, but I'll say that the Hebrew gospel is on the scene about the same time as the Gospel of Mark. That will be in the 60s. Luke uses both, and he's probably writing in the late 70s. Matthew uses, of course, Mark and his special sources, and he's writing closer to when John is, perhaps 90, but near the end of the first century. And Matthew has quite a number of similarities with the Didache, which also would be written in, or plausibly placed in that same period of 90 to 95.
Thank you for joining me today. Donnie, thank you for your super chats, and I thank everybody else for their participation in the live chat. And I will see all of you later. Thanks again, Professor Edwards.
Thank you for the invitation.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.